The ice ages are real. The next one is close, but it remains an enigma for the lack of prior experiences. All that we have ever known, the entire history of civilization, occurred in the brief span of the warm climate encircled in blue. We have no experiences of the time prior to that, as if the time prior pertained to a different world. This is not surprising, because the Ice Age world is so dramatically different than the historically experienced world, that it is essentially a different world that is dramatically incomparable with what we experience today. We need to wake up to the incomparable, because the present world is fast fading. It has been fading for more than 3,000 years already. The world is close to flipping back to being an ice world, which will likely happen in the 2050s. It will collapse back into glaciation, as it did when the previous interglacial ended. The consequences for humanity are enormous. All areas outside the tropics and subtropics, the pink zone, become reclaimed by the cold and become uninhabitable, and the rest of the world becomes uninhabitable too, for the lack of rain. The ice core records tell us how big the consequences will be that we have never experienced. The Little Ice Age of the 1600s, for example, is recorded as a half of a degree cooling, while the Ice Age is recorded as being 20 degrees colder in comparison, a 40 times steeper cooling. And the precipitation is recorded as reduced by 80%. This is a scene from the Little Ice Age. It was cold then. No one can live in a world 40 times colder. All of Europe becomes uninhabitable thereby, and likewise Russia and Canada. And the rest of the world becomes uninhabitable for the lack of rain. We can make our future Earth as an ice and dust planet habitable by us creating ourselves a new world deep in the tropics, operating securely and richly with technological infrastructures. But will we create them? We have 30 years left to get the infrastructures completed, such as building 6,000 new cities in the tropics and new infrastructures and industries, which haven't even been considered to date. The present choice is to let 99.9% of humanity die. To do nothing means committing universal suicide. That's the dimension of failing to meet the Ice Age challenge. Numerous modern measurements tell us that our present world has run its course and will be flipped back in the 2050s to being an ice planet, as it had been for 85% of the last 500,000 years. The Earth gets flipped into warm climates in 100,000 years intervals, and back to glaciation in every case without fail. These are not fade-in and fade-out transitions. They are digital transitions. They are caused by the sun flipping between two activity states, a high activity stage and a low activity stage. The solar transition between the two stages may be as short as a single day. The flipping of the sun is a natural process that results when the plasma density in interstellar plasma streams, which power the sun, falls below the minimal density level that enables electromagnetic primal fields to form that focus interstellar plasma streams intensely onto our sun. When there is enough density in the streams, the sun is intensely powered by this process, as it presently is, which pulls the Earth out of its otherwise normal glaciation state. With high-density plasma streams and active primal fields operating, the sun achieves its present surface temperature of 5,800 degrees Kelvin. If the plasma density drops below the level needed for the primal fields to form, the plasma streams simply flow by the sun. In this case, no plasma concentration around the sun happens. The reduced solar activity at a type of default level generates a correspondingly lower surface temperature, potentially in the range of 4,000 degrees. The sun flips between these two states every 100,000 years. It remains in the high activity state for roughly 12,500 years, and in the low activity state for the rest of the time. There is nothing in between the two states. The sun either has or doesn't have active primal fields operating. One state gives the sun its interstellar high-intensity boost, the other state doesn't. The flip point between the two states is determined by the physical principles that govern the forming of the primal fields. That's why the interglacial climate doesn't fade gradually into the glacial climate, but flips sharply and globally. The consequences are brutal for those who are not prepared for them. Ice age transitions are inherently digital transitions. They cannot be anything else. To ignore this fact is akin to committing suicide. That's a hard one to come to terms with. We had no historic experiences of this sort. Never throughout the entire history of civilization did we experience a time when the entire global agriculture becomes disabled simultaneously, and a large portion of the world's people tried to flee their territory from the cold, with no transportation infrastructure available on the needed scale, and with no place to go to. We have never experienced a time when the sun flipped to its default state. We have only experienced fringe effects. We have measured the sun getting weaker on its path to the flip point, the phase shift point. We have seen the increasing fringe effects in terms of increasing drought, flooding, cooling, and tornado events, and also earthquakes. While the growing magnitude of these fringe events should raise some eyebrows, They are incomparable with what we are heading into, and are heading into unprepared and fast asleep, as it were. The call to awake is far overdue. Waking up is a type of digital event too. One flips from being asleep and dreaming to being awake, facing the real world. And that's a hard thing to do, especially in science, where intentionally twisted dogmas have kept society asleep and locked into dreaming convoluted dreams where nothing is real, where the path to reality is blocked. This has been the case for centuries already, and more so in modern times. And the most twisted domain in science has become cosmology. The wake-up call is most imperative here, because facing reality on the most crucial front, where the future of civilization is determined, enables society to face the issue head-on and build itself a new technological world that the Ice Age dynamics cannot touch, and to use the resulting momentum as an opportunity to build a grander world than anything that has yet been built. This cannot be done by being asleep, but it can be done being awake. Being awake opens the gate to new paradigms, new potentials, and achievements that border on the miraculous. Because of the unique nature of the blocking factors, I will focus on two diverse allegories to illustrate the types of challenges that we face, which otherwise may not be easily apparent and therefore won't be addressed. The first allegory is the story of a time traveler who ventures centuries forward in time and encounters an elegant but docile people who live in a world abundant with food, but who lost their ability to know themselves and to communicate. One day the time traveler finds that his time machine has been stolen. While searching for it, he discovers another type of people living in the same area, a dirty, industrious, machine-loving people who labor underground and keep the physical operation functioning that makes the above-ground paradise possible. The traveler soon discovers that there exists a special relationship between the machine-loving people and the docile, elegant people. He discovers that the machine people maintain the elegant people as livestock and eat them. The story is a part of H.G. Wells' 1895 novel The Time Machine. It appears to have been designed to serve as a wake-up call to the oligarchy of empire that they should keep the advance of science and technology in check, or else the science and technology people would eat them for breakfast. The wake-up call apparently led to a debate in high society in the 1920s. If my memory serves me well, of relevant research done on this issue, about what to do with science. Should science be blocked or be scrapped altogether? Or should it be made accessible to a select elite of high society for its advantage? It appears that it was recognized that science cannot be blocked, but that it can be controlled and so twisted into knots with irrationality that it becomes essentially ineffective. It appears that this path was chosen and applied foremost to technology, tying it into knots, especially the plasma cosmology. As far back as 1913, Christian Olaf Bergland, a Norwegian scientist, explored the plasma cosmology. He has been called the first space scientist and the father of plasma experiments in the laboratory and space. He predicted that plasma was ubiquitous in space, meaning simply everywhere, that the whole of space is filled with electrons and flying electric ions of all kinds, so that it does not seem unreasonable, therefore, to think that the greater part of the material masses in the universe is found not in the solar systems or nebula, but in empty space. He wrote a huge 2-volume book on aurora research and the electric interaction of the sun with the earth. The book covers the Norwegian Aurora Polaris expedition of 1902 and 1903, with a preference of earlier expedition results going back into the 1890s. The recognition of a potential plasma universe was developed from this background, and it flourished in those days. It set up a stage for a completely new field of study. Later in time, the Swedish plasma physicist and pioneer Hannes Olof Gustav Alfven expanded the field of study, and in later years was honored with the 1970 Nobel Prize in Physics. He made many contributions to plasma physics, including with pioneering a model for electro-dynamics in plasma in the Milky Way galaxy, the famous Alfven model. But in between all this erupted the Big Bang, designed as a counter-theory. In the late 1920s, as if it was a response to the high-level debate over science and how to tie it into knots, the famous Big Bang theory was invented and was quietly spread across the world. It became so heavily debated and promoted that it became the mainstream concept about the universe. The Big Bang is the king of the mechanistic concepts of the universe. It stands in opposition to cosmic electrodynamics as a counter-theory in which cosmic plasma is simply ignored when all the previous momentous discoveries are brushed aside if they didn't exist. It is a theory that is devoid of real exclusive evidence, but is richly relying on highly mystic physics, including dark matter and dark energy, and so on. Its fame is that it is widely regarded as real, as one would expect, by the massive promotion it had. Also, the theory did have the evidently desired effect. The Big Bang theory, which is essentially a doctrine, has effectively squashed cosmic plasma physics as a science. With this achievement, it fulfilled the high-level objectives to obscure science and reason itself. Thus the Big Bang, the king of cosmic mechanics theories, still rules and may yet kill you with its elevated potential to hide the Ice Age challenge, so that the infrastructures will not be built to enable humanity to live through the ice planet phase. Fortunately, the king is but the king of a fairy tale. The throne that upholds the king's illegitimate authority is a fairy tale too. The foundation that the Big Bang theory of an expanding universe is based on is the redshift discovered in light from distant galaxies. The redshift is theorized to be the result of distant galaxies racing away from us, whereby the light is said to be stretched out, resulting in redshift. It is theorized that, like the tone of a train whistle changes pitch when a train approaches an observer, and then changes to a lower pitch when it recedes away, so light becomes stretched towards the red. Since the redshift had been observed in light from every direction, it has been theorized that the universe is expanding away from us into every direction in the wake of a giant explosion. This makes our galaxy, even the Earth, to be the center of the universe. Fortunately, the redshift tells a different story. Light is not an open wave like sound in the air. Let me illustrate the difference. If a person was to throw apples out of a fast-moving train, the apples would still remain apples before they hit the ground, no matter how fast the train was moving. The same is true for the photons of light emitted from a moving object. Photons of light are quanta of energy bound together into discrete packets of wave-like structures. Different quanta of energy produce different size packets that we recognize as different colors. As these quantum packets are propagated through space for millions or even billions of years, the energy contained in the packets tend to become dissipated, whereby the packets expand as they are no longer as energetically held together. In the process of energy dissipation, the purple light becomes blue light. It becomes a larger package. And the blue light becomes green light, and the green light becomes yellow light, and so on. The entire spectrum of the light becomes shifted towards the red, and the red, of course, gets shifted off the visible spectrum. The red shift has nothing to do with objects speeding away from us. It is essentially a proxy for distance and conditions in intergalactic space that affect energy loss in propagation. With this simple recognition, the keystone of the foundation that the Big Bang theory is built on falls apart. That's the fine thread of deception that puts holes into the entire fabric of the Big Bang fairy tale. If the thread is pulled, the entire fabric of related fairy tales unravels. Fairy tales are stories that pretend to be real, but are fundamentally impossible, though they make the world seem simpler. Maybe that's why they are often deployed to put little children to sleep. The trick works on adults too. Almost nobody talks about an impending ice age anymore, dreaming about global warming instead. The global warming doctrine also qualifies as a millstone, as an even bigger millstone. However, this doctrine is already waning, for reasons that the climate doesn't comply with the doctrine and is getting progressively colder instead, so that nothing more needs to be said on this subject. One of the big doctrines that still rules strong, quietly in the background, is the world depopulation doctrine. It is a giant, deadly millstone. The doctrine was put into high gear by one of the historic lobbyists for the atomic bomb, Bertrand Russell, the renowned pacifist of the peace of the grave. He advocated in 1953 that wars are disappointing, even big wars, in that they don't kill enough people. He advocated for biological war, probably like AIDS and so on, which in retrospect wouldn't likely have satisfied him either. He might have been happy, however, with the modern achievements in biological holocaust. The modern expression of the depopulation doctrine is perpetrated in the form of the mass burning of food in a world that has 1 billion people living in chronic starvation. The food burning is carried out through the biofuels process. The current volume of food burning consumes agricultural resources that would normally nourish an estimated 400 million people. The resulting Holocaust, in a world of close to 1 billion people living in chronic starvation, kills most likely upwards to 100 million people each year. 10 million is the official estimate. The victims of starvation die silently, agonizingly. In contrast, the biofuels process produces no energy gain and no beneficial effects whatsoever, other than to inflict genocide. Beneficial, as Bertrand Russell had termed it, and others in high society, as he had pointed out. The depopulation doctrine has high-level support. In 1986, a prince of the oligarchic system voiced his support of the doctrine with his wish to become incarnated as a particularly deadly virus to advance the cause of depopulation. The often stated target is to reduce the human presence on the earth from the current 7 billion to 1 billion people or less. The doctrine has become a silent genocidal war against humanity. With these millstones on its neck, humanity is terribly handicapped for the task to build itself a new world in 30 years with technological infrastructures that enable it to exist and to flourish with a 7 billion world population on an ice planet Earth. China may be inclined to move in the direction of creating a new world to meet the Ice Age challenge, so that all may live. But the West, that lectures China on human rights, remains committed to depopulation genocide, which the blocking of the Ice Age challenge would achieve, and would so dramatically overachieve that human life might cease. Thus, the depopulation millstone remains one of the great national security dangers of every nation on the planet. No one is secure in the face of this doctrine. The millstones need to be shed before it is possible for humanity to move forward with building itself a new world for living on an ice planet in 30 years. And this needs to be done now, because the transition is already in progress towards the Earth becoming an ice planet that is uninhabitable by today's standard. Still, a faint movement towards this awakening may have already begun. Our sun, which mechanistic astrophysics define to be essentially an invariable constant, is rapidly weakening, which some people, reluctantly perhaps, have begun to recognize. The fringe effects that are associated with a weakening sun are becoming more numerous and bigger in scale and harder to ignore, such as the increasing flooding, droughts, hurricanes, even earthquakes. Yes, it's time to awake. Just imagine. The sun is weakening in violation of the doctrine decreed by the king of the mechanistic universe, the Big Bang doctrine. The sun is getting rapidly weaker and is progressing towards its inevitable phase shift to the next glaciation cycle that is a natural phenomenon in plasma electrodynamics. The doctrine of the king is thereby defeated by reality, isn't it? But who owns the king? Who stands behind the king? With this considered, a second allegory comes to mind from far back in time, from very ancient time, when, apparently, the world was just as much tied into the doctrines as it is today, with the same conflict between doctrines and the truth, as if the Big Bang mysticism of today was not a new phenomenon. The writer of the allegory, in this case, distorts the image of man directly to make a point. The writer of the story lays before us an image of humanity as being made of dust. But who is the creator of it? The creator of the dust creatures is termed in the allegory the Lord God, a God conjured up by the ruling lords. Indeed, This is how the lords of the world throughout all the ages have regarded humanity, as but dust. The allegory then goes on to explore the Lord Ruler's fantasy. He explores it as a satire. In the satire, the Lord God places his dust creatures into a setting of paradise, filled with all the food they could ever want. The paradise, however, has one condition attached. The condition is that they must never eat of the tree at the center of the paradise, lest they would die. Here the writer of the allegory introduces a snake who suggests to the woman of the humanity made of dust that it is quite all right to eat of the tree that the Lord God has forbidden, suggesting to her that to eat thereof wouldn't kill her, but be an eye-opener. It would be an eye-opener indeed, like as touching one's own soul. It would enable her to discern the difference between the truths and doctrines. We are told that the woman complies with the suggestion and gives to her husband of it, who complies likewise. We are also told that as they eat of the fruit and their eyes become opened, they find themselves naked. Many people may have reached that stage at one point or another when they open their eyes after years of university training and suddenly recognize that they haven't learned anything real. They find themselves naked. In the allegory, the writer brings the Lord God back onto the scene at this point, who scolds the offenders fiercely and then expels them from the garden of easy living. The Lord God had no choice in this case. He must expel everyone who glimpses the truth that renders the dream doctrines as a deception and as fundamentally fake. He must expel them because there is no room for people waking up in his circus of dreams. "Get out of my universities," he might have shouted. "We don't tolerate people who are awake. When people awake, they become disturbers of the peace. Get out of our world. We operate a world of peace, a nicely silent peace." Of course, the expelled victims who are now free must take on the necessary task to discover for themselves what the dimension of the truth really is that they had merely glimpsed, which they were taught in the universities to avoid like the plague. They soon realize that it takes a lot of work, spade in the ground, to discover what is actually real. And this requires a lot of honesty with themselves. Those who make the grade on this score are actually quite few. Most people simply remain asleep, obediently, and accept the doctrine that the gods of the Lords dish out in the universities, and accept their diplomas that certify them as accomplished dreamers. Except in doing so, they waste their life and accomplish nothing productive, as if they had never lived. In the allegory, the heroes who defy the dreams of the world of the Lord God's universities are named Adam and Eve. Somebody had found their story significant enough for it to be placed into the opening pages of the Christian Bible, though the allegory is rarely ever seen in the manner as I have conveyed it here. An allegory is a story that conveys a message that one must discover for oneself. In retrospect, I would have written the ending differently, which would make more sense in our time. It doesn't make any sense that the people who had dared to open their eyes significantly would allow themselves to be expelled from civilization. They would cause a rebellion in heaven, in league with the angels, and expel the God of the Lords instead from the landscape of civilization. Get out of our hair, out of our land, out of our universities and governments and institutions, and take your corruption, your corrupted slaves, whores, whorehouses, gallows and crosses, and executioners with you. Be gone and never come back. That's how an awakened Adam and Eve would have gained a measure of freedom for the world. But those who actually do this in the real world are so extremely few that they seem not to exist. Those who speak for humanity in defense of it don't seem to exist, even while the collapse of the world is already in progress, that ends in 30 years with the Earth becoming an uninhabitable ice planet. The reason why those who awake to reality are so extremely few had been quietly written into the allegory, almost hidden. The writer portrays the voice from within, the voice of reason, of common sense, the voice of the human intellect, the voice of the human soul, so to speak, as a snake talking deception. That's how the gods of the Lords wish humanity to regard its innermost self, as a snake talking. They say to humanity, if you see evidence that should be the shifting of the magnetic pole location measured on the ground in northern Canada by repeated expeditions, shown in red, should have raised a lot of eyebrows, because the shifting of the magnetic pole has accelerated from the 1960s on. As it was, it didn't raise many eyebrows, nor inspired many questions. The 1960s time frame is significant as the general time frame when the dramatic weakening of the sun began, that we see reflected in diminishing sunspot numbers. The Ulysses spacecraft saw the same weakening trend in terms of diminishing solar wind pressure between 1992 and 2008. By drawing the facts together, it should have been dramatically evident that the entire solar system was getting weaker, which has its own magnetic field perpendicular to the ecliptic. Without external influences, the rotation of the Earth would create a magnetic field in line with its spin axis. Affected by a strong external magnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field would be deflected by the amount of the inclination of the Earth's spin axis. Such a strong deflection was measured by an expedition in 1831. Now, with the solar system getting weaker, the deflection is almost gone. the 22 degrees deflection has diminished to less than 4 degrees. The Earth's magnetic field is now more closely aligned with the spin axis than it ever has been, even while the Earth's magnetic field itself is the weakest in recorded history. While the pole drift is also affected by other factors within the Earth, the coincidence of it with the weakening of the Sun should raise some eyebrows, at least. It actually should do more than just raise a few eyebrows when one considers the fast rate of collapse of the collapsing solar wind pressure that Ulysses had measured. The fast rate projected forward indicates that the Sun, boiling off steam, as it does in a plasma-rich environment, will likely stop in the early 2030s, with which Phase 1 ends and Phase 2 begins, with the Sun getting colder. In reality, the boundary between the two phases will likely blur. The blur renders Phase 2, which is by far the most critical phase for humanity on Earth, a hard one to predict. Linear projection indicates that the weakening of the Sun will cause a set of its primal fields to fail in the early 2050s. This is just a projection, based on the historic fact that the Sun survived its slumber without sunspots for 30 years during the Little Ice Age, till it was revived again in the 1700s. At the current rate of collapse, the zero sunspot stage will likely be reached in the 2030s. This potential is generally acknowledged, but we have no measured historic comparison available to predict what happens thereafter. Here is where the magnetic pole drift measurements become significant. The fast rate of the pole shift that has been measured from the time that the diminishing of the Sun began in sunspot numbers in the 1960s suggests that the weakening of the primal fields, which create the cosmic magnetic field that affects the Earth, may be far more advanced than the collapse of the solar wind suggests. At the time of the Little Ice Age, the background support level was far stronger than its rate of decline would give us today. The weaker background density in interstellar space that gives us weaker primal fields, which the magnetic pole drift suggests, is tragically real. The weakening of the solar system that we see indicated in so many ways is bringing us ever closer to the threshold line beyond which the primal fields will collapse. It is somewhat uncertain in which year the collapse will happen. The current dynamics of the solar collapse might not keep the primal fields functioning far into the 2050s. The phase shift to glaciation may happen sooner. It could happen potentially in the late 2040s. The Ice Age startup could happen potentially in 30 years from now. The short time span means that the time for awaking to action is now. It's critical. An enormous amount of work needs to be done to build us a new world. Time is getting wasted by inaction. The sleep time should have ended more than a decade ago. If the third phase shift happens before we have prepared our world for it, then it becomes irrelevant. Indeed, then all considerations become irrelevant, as then almost no one will remain alive to be affected by them. The time for action is now. The great actions won't be taken, of course, to secure the future of humanity until the digital nature of the Ice Age phenomenon is understood and is acknowledged. The digital nature of the solar system's dynamics gives us the two widely diverse solar environments that are expressed in what may be termed the Ice Age dynamics, and its almost opposite and incomparable climates on Earth that we must live with. The climate on Earth necessarily reflects the flipping of the sun between its high and low-powered states. When the digital dynamics of the solar system are understood, actions will be taken by all of us to create us a new world for the inherently fast-changing environment. When this dawn towards action begins, it opens the door to the greatest industrial, economic, cultural, political, and scientific renaissance as has never been seen before. We do see already some stirring towards action in the symbolism for high-level events hosted in the free world, primarily in China. The symbols are of a type that may signify a high-level recognition of plasma astrophysics and the consequences of the unfolding electrodynamics. If this is the case, the symbols are extremely significant. The symbol of the 2017 Belt and Road Forum, for example, is highly reflective of the shape of the heliospheric current sheet surrounding the Sun, and the differential rotation of the Sun, which appears to be symbolized by a stepped structure. The stepped structure can be seen as symbolic for the bands of the Sun's rotational differences. The symbol even vaguely hints at the plasma inflow into the solar corona over its pole. Both features, the heliospheric current sheet and the differential rotation of the Sun, are exclusively features of the solar system's electrodynamics. The heliospheric current sheet is a sheet of plasma that flows between the Sun and the heliosphere that surrounds the solar system. The heliosphere is a shell of plasma located a far distance from the Sun, where the solar wind grinds to a halt. The illustration presented here is of the theorized shape of the current sheet, which cannot actually be seen, but has been measured technologically. Its existence, whatever its real shape may be, proves that the Sun is not a heated gas ball that is its own master, but is a part of a fast-changing electrodynamics complex which it responds to, by which it is powered, and which shapes its activity. That the Sun is not a heated gas ball is also evident by the fact that the Sun rotates significantly faster at its equator than at its poles. This phenomenon is not possible in gas dynamics. but is natural in electro-dynamics. Furthermore, an earlier Chinese-hosted world event had featured in its logo a symbol that is more significant for plasma electrodynamics than for the event itself. The logo for the 2016 G20 event features a plasma flow illustration of plasma flowing around the sun, which closely reflects the actual dynamics that power the sun, in contrast to the still widely accepted false doctrines about the sun. Whether these features are intended to signify that there is an awakening in progress in China cannot be determined. The potential is greatly encouraging, signifying that the long night of science slumber is coming to an end. Hopefully, this is the case. The core of the Belt and Road Forum symbol could also signify nothing more than an architectural structure from Chinese history. But why shouldn't China be the pioneer towards a new awakening to the real nature of the universe in which we live? This potential exists, seeing that China exists a far distance, separated from the gods of the lords who control much of humanity's science and keeps it under wraps with fairy tales. With the truth now shining through the wrappings unfurl ever more strongly with increasingly larger fringe effects, such as floods, droughts, hurricanes, and earthquakes, that China has experienced already in large measure. The massive increase of them should have raised some eyebrows by now, even rung some wake-up bells. China may be waking up. It is even possible that an awakening is happening in China to the impending phase shift to glaciation that renders the Earth an uninhabitable ice planet in the near future. The gala performance for the Belt and Road Forum in 2017 features a ballet performance that is centered on an image of what the Earth might look like as an ice planet. While it is possible that the performance reflects the traditional Chinese Mid-Autumn Moon Festival, it is not unreasonable to assume that the ballet had a higher focus. It is not unreasonable to assume that a highly advanced, science-oriented society is beginning to recognize what the future Earth will look like in the ice planet stage. The 2016 G20 Gala even hinted at how humanity might build itself a new world for living on an ice planet, which is most effectively created as set afloat on the equatorial seas. The entire G20 Gala was performed on water, on a stage submerged just inches below the surface of a lake. The dancers were literally dancing on water. There remains so much that the world needs to wake up to in order to prepare itself for the Earth becoming an ice planet, to which the transition is in progress, that we may really have to learn to walk on water, and not only symbolically, and this in leaps and bounds, to make up for the lost years wasted in dreaming. Tragically, The dreaming hasn't yet ended, though it should have ended long ago. Especially our dreaming about the sun should have ended, because this dreaming is so obviously off the mark that it is almost hard to ignore. When we awake, we can't help notice that in our dreaming nothing was actually real. We have been taught to dream that the sun is a sphere of hydrogen gas that is intensely heated from deep within by nuclear fusion reactions occurring in its core. But when we awake and look at the sun, we can't help noticing that our dreaming was far off from what we actually see and have seen for centuries. When we look through the umbra of sunspots, where holes have been torn into the surface of the sun, we see that the sun is dark inside instead of brighter. We begin to recognize that our dream visions were visions of fairy tales. We see such paradoxes about the sun wherever we look. Just look at the giant glowing loops on the surface of the sun. These are not phenomena of gas flow dynamics. Gas doesn't behave that way. Gas dynamics can't produce these types of gigantic loops that grow prominently on the sun. But in electro-dynamics, that defines the sun as a sphere of plasma, where every particle carries an electric charge, and its movement creates a magnetic field. The dynamic forming of these prominences, as they are called, is a natural, universal phenomenon. The dead-end doctrine of the hydrogen gas sun, which society has lulled itself into sleep with, is one of the biggest obstacles that has ever been created against humanity's waking up to the real world. Because the hydrogen gas sun can exist only in dreams. In the real world, such a sun is physically not possible. It simply cannot exist. The known mass of the sun is 1,000 times too light for it to be a sphere of hydrogen gas. A gas sphere of the size of the sun would have destroyed itself by gravitational compression long before it became as big as the sun is. A large celestial object of the size of the sun, or larger, can only exist as a plasma sphere, because in plasma physics, the concentration and distribution of mass is determined by electro-dynamic factors. In plasma, everything is electrically charged. The proton particles carry a positive charge, by which they repel each other. Its electron particles, that are 2,000 times lighter, have a negative charge. They dance between the protons and shield them from each other. When the plasma mass is large, gravity plays an additional role. Under gravitational pressure, the lighter electron particles begin to migrate to the surface. As they do so, the electric shielding of the protons diminishes at the core, which thereby repel each other more. By this principle, the core of the sun has the least mass density, and the surface the highest. That's why extremely large stars are able to exist. The giant star Uvaiskuti is nearly 5 million times larger in volume than our Sun, while its mass is only 10 times larger. Yet, with this tiny mass, that is so thin that it is almost a vacuum, the star outshines our Sun 340,000-fold. The phenomenon of such a supergiant star, which really does exist, is not even remotely possible as a phenomenon of gas dynamics. But with electrodynamics, that forge dramatically different effects, by which a sun becomes largely an empty shell. The phenomenon of a superlight and supergiant star falls well within the range of what one would expect for a plasma star in extreme cases. With our Sun being a plasma shell that is largely empty inside, it has a dense surface that is teeming with electrons. In this case, when a stream of interstellar plasma is focused onto such a sun, a powerful, almost explosive plasma interaction takes place. In the cauldron of this interaction, electrons and protons become combined into atoms. The atoms in turn emit the sunlight that we see. All light in the universe is emitted from atoms. The atoms serve as energy converters, especially at the surface of the Sun, where they are intensely activated by the movement of plasma, and to some degree also by photons. The synthesized atoms that create the sunlight, with which the Sun radiates its energy, are continuously created in all imaginable combinations, and are purged away from the Sun in continuous streams. As they fall away, they accumulate into planets. All the planets in the universe have been formed from atoms synthesized on the surface of a sun. With the Sun itself being merely an energy converter of electric plasma energy flowing into it from interstellar space through electromagnetic primal fields. The intensity of the Sun's operation, therefore, depends on the density and pressure of the plasma flowing onto it. Interstellar plasma is its lifeblood. When the input is strong, its activity is strong. When the input diminishes, its activity diminishes. When the plasma input diminishes dramatically, the solar activity can vary so dramatically that ice ages result on Earth with a 70% dimmer sun. This is a part of the Earth becoming an ice planet, potentially in the 2050s. This is also the only path possible for an ice age to occur. All this means that the climate on Earth is absolutely determined by electrodynamic conditions in interstellar space that affect the Sun from a long distance away. Ice Age phenomena are interplanetary electrodynamic phenomena and are digital in nature. The interstellar dynamics change slowly, but when the plasma density falls below the minimal threshold for primal fields to form, the resulting effect on the Sun can change quickly. Ice ages are never caused by mechanistic phenomena. They don't affect anything. Ice ages are caused by electro-dynamic phenomena with digital effects that are caused by primal fields forming and primal fields collapsing according to interstellar conditions. The closest visual correlative on the minuscule scale are the red sprites that typically form between the ionosphere and high storm clouds. The sprites form rapidly, and when the conditions that form them are exhausted, typically within a second, they vanish. In the vastly larger solar system, the primal fields typically remain active correspondingly longer, for roughly 12,500 years. As I said before, the on-off states of the solar boosting are dramatically evident in climate records of ice cores drilled in Greenland and Antarctica. The digital climate oscillation is also evident in deep-sea benthic formations. They correspond well with what had been measured in the ice cores drilled at the Vostok station in Antarctica. In benthic forums, the climate record is preserved in ratios of heavy isotopes. These ratios vary by temperature at the surface of the sea, because water with the heavy oxygen evaporates at a different rate at different temperatures, which alters the ratio. The resulting ratio is locked in the calcium shells of microorganisms living at the surface of the sea and is thereby preserved. Calcium is the product of water and carbon dioxide. The heavy oxygen ratio in seawater are preserved in the calcium created in historic times. The measured ratios reflect the same pattern that are found in ice cores. The pattern that we find there has the same digital characteristic. This proves that the ice ages are digital and global. When one looks backwards in time, far beyond the 500,000 years that we have ice core records of, it becomes apparent that the digital flip-flop ice age climate variations stop at around 3 million years ago. The reason is that in earlier times, the plasma density in the galaxy had been significantly greater, so that our Sun's primal fields did not collapse by oscillations in plasma streams. This proves that the digital nature of our ice ages result from the currently weak galactic environment, and has absolutely nothing to do with mechanistic causes. When one looks further back in time in the benthic record, one notes that the galactic plasma environment, which is reflected in the Earth's environment, was very much stronger around 100 million years ago. If one looks still further back in time, more than 500 million years, it becomes apparent that our galaxy is presently at the weakest point it has been in 440 million years, so that the current ice age cycles are an extremely rare anomaly that results directly from the extremely weak plasma density in the galaxy. As I had noted in previous exploration videos, The currently weak state of the galaxy is the result of overlapping resonance effects in plasma streams that our galaxy is the node point of. As I had also noted, the fact that our galaxy is located at the node points between two plasma streams has recently been proved by NASA in the form of its discovery of large plasma structures perpendicular to the galactic disk. The point in all that is that it is critical that the digital nature of the Ice Age be recognized as plasma phenomena that are rooted in the very nature of the universe itself, rather than being mechanistic phenomena of orbital characteristics, as society has believed for half a century, or has been made to believe in. Humanity is in urgent need to wake up to the discovered reality that determines its future on the Earth as an ice planet, because its very existence depends on this awakening. If humanity awakes in time, it will build itself a new world with technological infrastructures for living on an ice planet. In the process of it, it will create itself the greatest renaissance of all times. Inversely, if humanity remains asleep, it dies, except for a very few, even while it would live. I have chosen the Adam and Eve allegory as a means to invite you to open your eyes and discover for by yourself what is real, because you will act on what you choose. Is the electro-dynamics plasma universe real? It offers you a view into the future with massive evidence supporting it, and with an opportunity attached to create yourself a new world to live in before the old world becomes an ice planet. Or is the mechanistic universe real that invites everyone to remain comfortably asleep? People are content in their dreaming with the song in their mind. We don't do evidence, we have our comfortable feeling and strong confidence in it, which they have been taught by the would-be masters of the world. Each person has the option, of course, to sing the Lord's deadly song. The human being is sovereign by design, but while being free in choosing, one still is bound to the consequences of the choice made. Freedom is not absolute. The stakes are high. The greatest freedom is only found in choosing correctly, because then the consequences will be life instead of doom. Maybe this is what the writer of the allegory had tried to convey. There are many other interpretations possible, of course, of the allegory of the tree of life in the midst of the garden of paradise, that the gods that speak for the lords of the world has decreed must never be touched. I have applied the allegory to an aspect that the writer of the story could never have imagined, since the real nature of the Ice Age dynamics had only been discovered a little more than a decade ago. Nor would a writer in ancient time have imagined that a tiny group, sick with greed, would amass the controlling power to choke the entire world to death, and that humanity would sink so low in its own sight to let this happen. Or maybe the writer did see similar tragedies occurring in ancient times, and had tried to derail the train even then. It may even be that the anciently attempted derailment of the oligarchic system is already moving again, quietly in the background, and is asserting itself. In real terms, the oligarchic system is already functionally dead. It exists as but an empty shell that is so dead within that nothing works anymore, that is precariously upheld with bailout funds stolen from society. In the shadow of this fading, we see powerful alternatives developing in some parts of the world, such as China's Belt and Road Initiative for win-win international cooperation on infrastructure development, which is hugely gaining ground. Of similar significance is the already unfolding New World financial architecture for the betterment of life on the Earth, the BRICS system, that combines the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa on a common economic development platform that is fast gaining ground, while the Lord's dollar system is fading like a dying dream. With these already large movements, we may see a foundation developing for the grand explosion in industrial development that the recognition of the Ice Age challenge will inevitably spark when the need for building a whole new world for 7 billion people is taken out of the grave smothered with doctrines and is placed on the table to be acted on. When this happens, we haven't seen anything yet in terms of what can be accomplished by humanity as the most powerful species of life on Earth. Everyone's future will then be secure, and their life will no longer be at risk. It is high time that the oligarchic system is eclipsed by progress on all fronts and be swept off the stage by the dynamics of history. The depopulation doctrine has a long history that goes back to the 1790s, when a Venetian monk gave a gift to the oligarchy that owned him, which justified radical genocide. The earth is too full of people, was the message of his book on population. The book was published in the years when the American Constitution was developed, perhaps as a counter-weapon against it. The book was picked up by many in the oligarchic system. Malthus picked it up in Britain. Out of it came the workhouses that worked the poor to death. It also became the eugenics theory that justified the persecution of inferior people. Hitler loved this notion that became the Holocaust and war without mercy. Bertrand Russell promoted it big time in Britain. It became the guiding star up to the highest level of the British and related oligarchies. Out of it came the doctrine of the controlled disintegration of the world economy. Its first expression became the takedown of the protection of the world's currencies that President Franklin Roosevelt had pioneered for the recovery of nations. With the protection removed, the currencies became gambling chips, and the nations became hopeless debtors. The interest rate shock that came later had a similar intention and caused enormous economic devastation. When the shock led to a crisis, Alan Greenspan created the financial derivatives gambling orgy, which he referred to as a financial atomic bomb. He did this as chairman of the Federal Reserve, a private oligarchic institution that owns the US dollar. While the bomb was going off, Wall Street quietly bribed the US Congress to scrap the protection of the US banking system by rescinding the Glass-Steagall law from the Franklin Roosevelt years. With this accomplished, nothing remained safe. The nation's bank deposits can now be used as gambling chips, with the intention that it will bankrupt the banking system, which was evidently intentional. It became that in 2008, when the gambling system did implode. That's when the bailout orgy began. $50 trillion in bailout funds had been donated by the American nation, officially to stave off the banking collapse, but with the real intention to destroy the nation more deeply, which it did over the following years. The 50 trillion were wasted. It didn't make the dead horse come alive again, that the financial system had become by then, by dousing it with ever more fresh blood. Nor was this the objective, to bring the dead horse alive again. But the bailout process did prolong the appearance that the dead horse still lives, which serves, and this served the further destruction of the physical economy that society's living depends on. The end product is unprecedented economic collapse, unemployment, genocide, poverty, homelessness, refugee chaos, ever more wars and terror. And the chaos is intentional too, under the depopulation doctrine that drives the economic destruction of the world for the security of the oligarchic system that breeds empire like a disease. The intention is evident in the vehement opposition to America wanting to reinstate its Glass-Steagall bank protection law. It has been declared from the highest level of the British oligarchy that the reinstatement would be considered an act of war against it. Indeed, it would be an act of war, a war against the forces that destroy humanity. Even the global warming hoax, as is now admitted, drives the economic destruction and with it the depopulation agenda. The official UN objective is to roll back the historic industrial revolution that had enabled too many people to live, as the Lords see it. And this is not an overstatement. The Russian Academy of Science is said to have commented in the days of the Kyoto Accord that the accord is in effect an economic suicide pact. Since the dead horse that the world financial system is still dead, laws have been created and are already on the books in many nations that allow the collapsing banks to essentially confiscate their depositors' assets by a process of bail-in. In the evidently intended chaos, should the bail-in happen, the physical economy invariably disintegrates and the world dies. This is the intention behind the doctrine of depopulation, which will play itself out if it is not stopped, and it will not be stopped until the oligarchic system of empire is understood for what it is by what it does. By this line of understanding, the world is divided, and has been divided for a long time. All other divisions in the world are secondary, and are subsumed by the prime division between economic development and depopulation. With China having developed itself the most powerful economy in the world, its achievement is seen with envy as a miracle. This perception is a trap. China's economic achievement is not a miracle. It is merely the lawful outcome of the modernized version of Hamiltonian economics that reflect the principles the USA was founded on, which remain the most efficient principles to date. China's economic achievement only appears like a miracle when it is seen in comparison with the West that is committed to its self-destruction, as it must by its fundamental doctrine, depopulation. There is no such thing as economic warfare between East and West happening. We see two separate phenomena happening. China develops the most precious asset that humanity has, its people. In comparison, the West destroys its most precious with the acts of depopulation. It idealizes world collapse. Cooperation with China becomes natural when the depopulation mantra fades into the trash bin of history. Until that day, the world remains in peril. It remains in peril by not responding to the Ice Age challenge. The only real danger that humanity is facing, which it is facing collectively, is that it is unprepared when the Earth becomes largely an ice planet in 30 years, which then becomes 99.9% uninhabitable by today's standard. Without a large-scale technological response, building infrastructures for Ice Age living, humanity is doomed. Inversely, wizard life is protected and enabled to flourish. We can create for ourselves a perfectly livable world with large-scale technological infrastructures fit for the ice planet. But it won't happen with the depopulation policy breaking our wings, so that all is designed to crash. Here the ancient Adam and Eve allegory becomes highly significant, with its message that we wake ourselves up out of the dream state by eating of the tree of life. China is life-oriented. with cultural optimism based on achievement. Will we in the West take the steps necessary to become so likewise? Will we become life and development-oriented in the West, like China? Will we develop ourselves in order to be able to join hands across the world on a platform of common interest in a community of principle? This is the key question. This is the single most critical question of our time. We cannot face the Ice Age challenge with the world divided, one part focusing on developing life and the other focused on destroying it. Military platforms divert the focus away from the supreme danger to the whole of humanity, which is the impending Ice Age phase shift in the 2050s. Weapons don't build structures for living. They divide and isolate instead of embrace and uplift one another. To be or not to be is the critical question before us now. It is the supreme question, while the Earth is rigidly on track to becoming an uninhabitable ice planet. A mere 30 years remain for humanity to build itself a new technological world that is fit for living under Ice Age conditions. This critical question pertains also to science. Science is our pathway to life. Science, life, and humanity is one. This path to truthful science is presently blocked with convoluted dreams that flow from the ongoing policy for the controlled disintegration of science that universal science has been subjected to worldwide. But since the dreaming by policy is artificial, it is possible for humanity to awake itself from the dreaming by simply opening its eyes. Nobody can be as densely stupid as not to notice what's happening before one's very eyes. The evidence is overwhelming. The fringe effects are hard to ignore. So how can we get to open our eyes? As I said earlier, the controlled disintegration doctrine is not only applied to economics, but is also applied to science. We must awake on this front more urgently. We must awake to the recognition that the Big Bang doctrine by policy blocks the recognition of the Ice Age dynamics. And we must recognize why the Big Bang policy exists, why it blocks our responding to real science, and that by blocking it, it advances the intended genocidal effect with the goal to depopulate the planet. It may seem sacrilegious to refer to the Big Bang concept of the universe as a doctrine by policy, but apart from the fact that no exclusive evidence supports the doctrine, the timing it suggests that it reflects the Wellesian anti-science policy that culminated in the great debate in the 1920s of how to stop science in its tracks. It serves this policy and has the intended effect. The biofuels doctrine, too, has the intended effect of the controlled disintegration policy. Both the Big Bang and biofuels doctrines under this policy aim to assure the collapse of the world population. But the train doesn't stop at the intended station. It rolls on to the bitter end by preventing humanity from meeting the Ice Age challenge. If it comes to this bitter end, then we are back to where we started from, when only 1 million people worldwide had survived the last Ice Age. The biofuels doctrine of food burning, officially to stave off global warming, sets up a problem in the mind for which no solution is deemed possible, except the self-murdering of society by burning its own food to save the planet. This trap tends to induce an increasingly infantile type of thinking. It produces a lower level of thinking that is harder to wake up from. In the allegory, Adam and Eve had been comparably easy to wake up. In modern time, this is harder and harder to accomplish. Someone who shrugs and closes his eyes in the sight of the ongoing biofuels holocaust of upwards to 100 million people per year is already mentally far past the stage of being merely asleep. How does one wake up the dead? Maybe such persons would be jolted back to life if they came upon a gas station that advertises clean gas with big signs. Just imagine, we sell undiluted gasoline, 100% genocide-free. The encounter of such a sign might raise some eyebrows. It might even wake somebody up. As it is, such gas stations do not exist. Instead, the fuel dilution ratio, E10 or E15, is almost hidden, written in small letters on a small sticker. In real terms, the wake-up call is rooted in the heart. It is rooted in the nature of humanity. In the native air of man, the mind and science is one. This science is not fake and perverted, but is truthful to what is true. Nor do we exist apart from it. We can run with it. This is the greatest power we can have, to wake us up. The bottom line is we are living in pioneering territory. No one has succeeded yet to usher the depopulation doctrine and the system that drives it off the stage of civilization, together with the doctrine of the controlled disintegration of the economy and the doctrine of the controlled disintegration of science worldwide. This victory to freedom needs yet to be achieved. The victory to freedom needs to be achieved no matter what it takes, no matter the effort required and the difficulties involved. We must succeed to win, because unless we do succeed, our children are at risk. They have no chance otherwise for survival, much less to have a future. This type of default fate is not acceptable. But why should we fail to win? As human beings, we have the power to become a new wind in the world that sweeps clean the pages of history and writes a new page, a page of life as has not been written for a long time. There is vitality in the movement of the wind. and more so in being the wind itself, in setting its direction towards the freedom of humanity from dead axioms, false beliefs, imprisoning doctrines. The age of the coffin is drawing to a close. The age of living abundantly is at hand. The opportunity lays before us to create a new world. Just imagine building 6,000 new cities in the next 30 years for living where no one has lived before. Imagine freedom from hunger, freedom from want, freedom from war, freedom from fear. Imagine freedom to love. There is vitality in being in the wind. Who would want to be asleep in times like these? Happy birthday, humanity. The winds to freedom flow in the native air of man, where mind and science is one, where nothing is impossible. On this path, we are staged to succeed and to celebrate each step along the way. This may have been the reason behind the Russian celebration of a breakthrough in casting ISIS off the stage in Palmyra in Syria, displacing the horrors of war and massacres and executions and destruction with a spark of the beauty of the culture of humanity. The director of the Mariinsky Theatre Orchestra of St. Petersburg, Valery Gergiev, brought the Mariinsky Symphony Orchestra into this desert war zone on May 5, 2016, for a celebration of life with a prayer for Palmyra, in an act of defiance of the inhumanity of war, and as a beginning to wake a few people up. Let's do this on the world stage and on the universal scale.